Excuse me, if I could please have your attention for just one moment. We're about to begin, but if you could all just take one quick second to turn off your cell phones and electronic devices. And please note that tonight's meeting will be on the record and streamed live on CFR.org and the Council's YouTube page. Thanks, and we'll get started shortly.
Well, good evening, and welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations, and welcome in particular to the Robert B. McKeon Endowed series on military strategy and leadership. I'm Richard Haas. I'm president of the Council on Foreign Relations. I just want to explain that this series was made possible by a generous gift from a good friend of the Council, Bob McKeon. Bob was also a good friend, personal friend, and this is the fourth lecture that we've held since Bob's death in 2012, and we're very grateful to see his wife Claire here tonight with us tonight to celebrate this important part of Bob's considerable legacy. Tonight marks the 15th time that CFR has hosted the service chiefs, and we're honored to have all of them here with us tonight, including 3 for the first time. 1, Admiral Zukumf of the Coast Guard for the 2nd time, but also I'm going to single out Mark Welsh, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, for the last time. And General, I just want to say thank you, not just for tonight, but for what you've done for this country over the many decades.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And David will properly introduce all 5 of these gentlemen. I also want to warn them that for the first time, this event is on the record. And I should also say that all 5 have been read their Miranda rights.
That's a deal breaker.
Now, there's numerous areas where the work of the Council on Foreign Relations and the military overlap, from Laurie Garrett's analysis of the military's response to Ebola, to the contribution of our Stanton nuclear fellows, and from the work, say, by Senior Fellow Max Spoot on wars big and small, to all that we're doing on cybersecurity. Our latest task force on North Korea will provide an assessment of policy toward that country against the backdrop of its enhanced nuclear and missile capabilities. And this task force will release its report in June, co-chaired by Sam Nunn, the former senator, and a gentleman known very well to these men, Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I'd be remiss also if I didn't mention that we just gave up one of our own here to work in tandem with 2 of these 5 men, and that's former senior fellow Janine Davidson, who was recently sworn in as the 32nd Undersecretary of the Navy. Finally, CFR is fortunate enough to be one of the institutions with which the U.S. military partners. Every year, the Council hosts a military fellowship program in which 5 military officers, mid-career, spend a year in residence at our headquarters here in New York. This program goes back more than half a century now and has hosted some 140 military officers, and to me the most impressive statistic of all, half of whom have gone on to the rank of general or admiral. And this program is but one example of how the U.S. military makes a sustained investment in its most valuable asset, and that's America's men and women in uniform. I also think it helps explain why the military is one of the most professional and one of the most respected institutions in American society. Indeed, it sets an example that the rest of us would be wise to follow. I know that everyone here joins me in thanking the chiefs for taking the time out of their schedules to be with us tonight, but more importantly, I know everyone here joins me in thanking them for what they do for all of us the other 364 days a year. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
There's no shortage of issues to discuss, from a Middle East that continues to unravel to new security concerns in Europe and Asia. There's also new domains, from cyberspace to outer space to the Arctic, new questions regarding financial and human resources, and rumor has it there's the prospect of a new commander-in-chief and administration in a little more than 8 months. To ask these and other questions, it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's presider, David Sanger. Field Marshal Sanger, as you know, is the national security correspondent for the New York Times, where he's been for some 3 decades now. Twice he's been a member of Times reporting teams that won the Pulitzer Prize. Gentlemen, you are in very capable hands. David, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Richard. Thank all of you for coming and doing this again. Pure evidence that recidivism lives out here. You guys are willing to come back. Thank you to Richard and all of you to coming out. I want to thank my parents who are here, including my dad, who's a veteran of Okinawa and Iwo Jima and was lucky enough to meet the chiefs earlier. So thank you, Dad, for coming as well.
Yeah.
Let me very briefly introduce our group of service chiefs. Their longer biographies are in the material you have, but To my immediate left is General Mark Welch, who, as you heard, was Chief of Staff of the Air Force and has been commander of tactical fighter squadrons, the chief of the Defense and Space Operations Division. There's basically no job in the Air Force, I think, at this point that General Welch has not had. We're very lucky to have him with us today. General Milley of the Army, who I think you heard before, is now the 39th Chief of Staff of the Army. He's been in many different groupings, including Special Forces, over the last 35 years. And, of course, also was in Afghanistan, served in the operations staff of the Joint Staff, and military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, I guess when it was Bob Gates, was that right? Yeah.
Correct.
Who's often on this stage as well. Admiral John Richardson, our newest arrival here, a submariner for, did you tell me, a quarter century or
About that, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In both attack subs and boomers, has been the commander of Naval Submarine Forces, and he's truly an expert on our nuclear submarine force. Holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from MIT. General Neller from the Marine Corps, 37th Commandant, has...
MIT degree here.
What's that?
I said no MIT degree here.
Oh, well, sorry about that. But you were at the University of Virginia, so you can talk about Thomas Jefferson every time the MIT thing comes up, right?
It just doesn't seem to match up.
Yeah, okay. General Neller has been division commander and assistant division commander for the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, president of Marine Corps University, a number of joint assignments, and we're delighted to have him here. And finally, Admiral Zukumf, who's the 25th Commandant of, 25th Commandant of the Coast Guard, has had that job now for about 2 years. And previous to that, he was commander of the Coast Guard Pacific area. He was probably well known to many of you who watch TV during the Deepwater Horizon spill, which is something that he was the on-scene coordinator for the federal government, directing the 47,000 responders to that. So my plan for the evening is as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about some issues that are on the news, and then we're going to talk about what it is that the chiefs talk about when they get into the tank, which is the future of the force, what it is that they need to be able to do to prepare for both the threats 5 and 10 years out or longer, and also begin to think about what kind of resources one would need, how you change the force in that direction. So I'm hoping to speak not only about what's going on today, but where they see the military headed. But let's start with today. And General Milley, let's start with you. You know, when you think about the 5 big areas.
Say General Neller, is that what you said?
General Milley.
Said Milley.
Because when I heard Neller,
Yeah.
psych up.
You can pass these off a little bit later on, yeah. We had a phone conversation yesterday, and every time we got to a hard question, General Milley said, "Now, I think that's 4," and he named somebody who wasn't on the call.
Good technique. We do that in the tank all the time as well.
Yeah. The Secretary of Defense has talked about the 5 big areas of effort for the military these days: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and of course the counterterrorism mission. And these are very different kinds of missions, because counterterrorism requires you to be focused in on small forces, very precision in applying a large amount of force in a small amount of area. We can big intelligence issues, whereas China, Russia are more our traditional kinds of threats. I want to start off by asking you on the counterterrorism side, how do you assess, General Milley, the speed with which we reacted to the rise of ISIS 2 years ago, and how you think we're doing with it today?
Well, when I became chief in August, and I've served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and been tracking both the intel and from personal knowledge, talking to commanders, et cetera. Went over there in September, did not think we were doing very well, and I thought that the enemy, ISIS, had essentially had the strategic initiative. They came on the scene in the spring of 14, and we came up with a campaign plan, and that campaign plan, like any war plan, has to be adjusted based on the facts on the ground. So last fall, we adjusted that campaign plan and then went forward and sought the permission of the senior leaders of the United States. They approved that, and you're seeing today bits and pieces of it in the news. But today, right now, my assessment is significant progress has been made, and that's quite a bit different than what I saw in the fall. So in terms of land, for example, the territory of the caliphate has been reduced significantly. Enemy combatants, both at the lower level, but more importantly at the leadership level, have been significantly attrited. Their finances are under intense pressure. Their morale has gone down, and their ability to move inside their own territory and their interior lines has been significantly degraded. The task from the president is from President Obama, is to destroy ISIS. So all of that progress I'm describing is important, it's significant, but we have not yet destroyed ISIS. And that is yet to come, but I'm very confident that the strategic plan that we have is working, and I'm very confident of the outcome.
When I walk through your building, or on those days that they let me in, I hear people say, you know, we're not going to accomplish the task of actually destroying them until we have a Sunni force on the ground that can take them on the ground in a way that President Obama has clearly been unwilling to allow American forces to go do, given the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you agree with that? And how much closer do you think we are to organizing a Sunni force that can finish off that job?
I do agree with it. I've fought a fair amount of time over there, and I don't think the smartest strategic move is to put a lot of American soldiers on the ground. I think that would be counterproductive. Some, for sure, to train, advise, assist, enable, to provide some forward advisory effort to bring in fires from either naval or air platforms, and to help the Iraqi security forces to build up their capabilities, and the Kurdish forces. At the end of the day, we have got to work by, with, and through indigenous forces in order to destroy ISIS. And it's correct that there's going to have to be some Sunni ground force. We're working with the Iraqi security forces and the various Kurdish forces to do that. But it's their fight, it's their country, and it's an existential threat to them. We're there to help, assist, advise. There's U.S. interests at stake. And I think it may be slower than if it were Americans to do it, but at the end of the day, it'll be sustainable, and that's what's significant.
General Welsh, one of the notable elements of this war against ISIS, but before that against al-Qaeda, and before that generally in Afghanistan and Iraq, has been the astounding use by the Air Force and also by the CIA, but mostly by the Air Force, of unmanned vehicles. You've seen those really change the nature of the Air Force in your time. You've gotten to the point, I think, when, correct me if I'm wrong on this, you probably had more pilots in training for unmanned aircraft than you did for manned aircraft. And it looks like that is the trend that is continuing. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned in the course of this succession of wars, about what it is that unmanned craft do well for us, what they don't do well, what we're always going to need piloted aircraft for, and particularly talk a little bit about Syria and Iraq in this current struggle.
Thanks, David. First, thank you for being here and taking your time to do this, and thanks to the ambassador and to Ms. McKeon for the opportunity for us to be here. It's really a privilege. Thank you. We keep repeating it's not drone, it's not an unmanned aircraft, it's a remotely piloted aircraft, which we're even getting tired of saying, and everybody's really tired of hearing it. The point is that it is a new tool with a whole lot of people who are involved in using it. From the people actually operating the controls, the people who are watching the feeds that it sends back, to the people who make the decisions on what to do with that information. It is a heavily manned enterprise. They're just not all sitting on or riding in the airplane. So what we've done essentially is extended sensors. And we've put sensors orbiting over the battle space. So we can use them to develop targets. We can use them to observe quality and pattern of life. We can use them to observe movement. We can use them to actually target. And so in that regard, it's a natural evolution of warfare. It's just a different type of technology being used for the same things we've been trying to do since the Civil War with aircraft of some type. And so there's not a lot of mystery in how we're using them. It's just to be better at what we've always done. Where we should use remotely piloted aircraft in the future, or even autonomous unmanned aircraft in the future, is in those areas where they provide benefit over having a manned platform. In the near term, that's not in deciding how to deliver nuclear weapons, for example. It's not moving your families around. It's in those things where you need an aircraft that can operate for periods of time that the human body can't sustain, or can go into a situation where you don't need to put a human body at risk to do a task that the airplane can do by itself. And that's what we've done. We still have a very small percentage of our forces actually on unmanned aircraft. It's less than 10%, significantly less than 10%.
And what will that be 10 years from now, you think?
I don't think it'll be a whole lot more than that 10 years from now. 20 to 30 years from now, I think it'll start to shift, but it's never going to be in my lifetime. It will not be, which is about 30 years. It will not be a huge shift, because we're still figuring out how to use these things. We're just past the right flyer stage, if you want to make an analogy to manned aircraft. We are just past that step in the unmanned world, and it's going to be spectacular to watch where it goes. But it doesn't necessarily go bigger. They may get smaller. They may be connected to manned platforms. Wingmen who can do different tasks for a pilot in an F-35 is an example. Unmanned wingman is a concept that we're testing now. It's going to be very successful. There's just lots of ways to use this technology to do the things we've always done in a better, more comprehensive way. By the way, the biggest change in Iraq and Syria and ISIS, and from an air perspective, is in August of 14, when this began, we looked at them as a terrorist group. And we targeted them as a terrorist group. And we tried to collect intelligence on them as a terrorist group. They are much more than that now. And they, as a result of that, the initial strategy that Mark referred to, let them have a vote and kind of a direct activity for probably the first 6-8 months, in my view. And then we started to realize that they looked an awful lot like something much more than a terrorist group. They had infrastructure. They had training infrastructure, recruiting infrastructure, financial infrastructure, governance infrastructure. They had what looked like fielded military forces, and they had this terrorist component. And from an Air Force perspective, you can attack all those different pieces simultaneously. And that's been the change over the last 6 to 8 months.
And we've seen one other change in the past 6 to 8 months. We've had the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary, some of you in testimony, talk about the use of cyber right alongside your air power, your ground power. And this is the first time I've ever seen the U.S. government acknowledge the use of offensive cyber capability and make the point that it is just another weapon in the arsenal. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you integrate that. You obviously have people from Cyber Command who are working alongside you. And then also a little bit about what the risks of that are. Are you normalizing cyber warfare even while we're using it against an enemy like ISIS? Who wants to
John, you want to take that one?
It's a great question for the Navy.
Yeah.
Well, I think the point to be made is that, we talk about this in the tank quite a bit, is that every one of these conflicts now is sort of trans-regional, right? There's no such thing as a purely regional conflict anymore. Everything stems, beyond trans-regionally, if not globally. Cyber being a big part of this, and that everything it happens in multiple domains at once. And so, if this kind of expands on what General Welsh was saying in terms of, appreciating this fight here for what it really is, the full dimensionality. Let's develop a fully developed air campaign to get at all of those, and then extend it even beyond that, so that we're looking at every tool that we've got to really, as the president wants us to do, is to crush this enemy. And so, this cyber dimension is.
But you do consider it a normal tool, and if you think, there are a lot of analogies that are made between nuclear and cyber, for example. But nuclear, we decided years ago, would be put aside not to be used as a normal weapon of war. We've made the same decision about chemical, biological, many others. But cyber, it seems as if in the past 8 or 10 years, we've come to the conclusion now this can be used right alongside everything else you're
Well, I
doing.
think the point is that we can decide it, but the fact is it's a pretty hot war in the cyber domain going on right now. And so, we're sustaining hundreds of thousands of attacks, per day. The team has sort of stood up, organized, and organized their defenses to become very capable in this. And so this is an area where the fight is on.
Right. I wanted to talk a little bit about another considerable adversary, one that you're facing in the Pacific. Admiral Zukumf, I know you spent a fair bit of your time in the Pacific as well. And it's the concerns about a rising China, but particularly about the South China Sea. We've seen a lot of back and forth in the past year between the Navy and others and the White House about the degree to which you want to run freedom of navigation operations down into these areas that the Chinese have claimed their own. There's a lot of concern that something could go wrong along the way, that somebody could get a little hot-headed. Tell us a little bit about what your concerns are there.
Well, I think that, first of all, South China Sea, an extremely important part of the world for the entire world. About 30% of the world's trade flows through that part of the oceans, and so advocating for the rule set that enables that trade to proceed on a very open and level playing field, allowing all players to prosper and compete, if you will, without conflict. Continue to advocate for that rule set so that, as the president and everybody else say, we can operate and fly and sail wherever international law allows. So that, I think, is the first mission there, is to preserve our ability to do that, preserve our access through that part of the world. And so, it's not just us, and it's not just the military. This is a whole of government approach. I think we need to make sure that we engage not only the military element of power, but also the diplomatic and economic, which are extremely important in that world. And so it really is a whole of government approach, and it's also a multinational approach. And so as you've seen the dynamic really change there, you're seeing partnerships emerging with nations in that region that have really grown, particularly recently, and new partnerships forming even after years and decades of people not working as closely together. And so it is a changing dynamic. It involves not only naval forces, but also the rest of the military arm, whole of government, and a regional solution. With respect to the freedom of navigation operations, I think that those are terrifically targeted operations, because they do exactly what we want them to do, which is advocate for that international rule set, and they don't extend beyond that. It's just a pure advocacy for that system. And so we design those very carefully. It's a policy decision that is made and interwoven with those other elements of power. And so I think both aircraft, ships, ready to execute those as they fit into the plan.
Admiral Zukunft, there's been a lot of discussion that this is actually, in some ways, a better role for the Coast Guard, yours and others around the world, that it's a little less threatening when you put Coast Guard ships in. It's got more of a sense of freedom of navigation, safety for those at sea, and so forth. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the Pacific, something people don't think all that much about because they think of much more of your closer to home operations.
Well, first and foremost, I have an open and frank dialogue with my counterpart in China. And it's important as service chiefs, that whether it's Russia, whether it's China, when we see acts of provocation where we can pick up the phone and say, what is your intent? So at least in that regard, we have that capability. So in my interactions with China, the China Coast Guard, they used to call themselves the Five Dragons. They're 5 maritime, non-PLA services. 4 of the 5 merged to become China Coast Guard. Lo and behold, the racing stripe, the lettering, looks mighty familiar to us. Intellectual property rights, perhaps, at play there. But what we're seeing is China Coast Guard is on the front line provoking our United States Navy. We're seeing Chinese fishing trawlers provoking the United States Navy, carrying out sovereign acts, but just over the horizon is the PLA. And so as our biggest concern is about a miscalculation, but their Coast Guard has not been transparent in terms of what their intent is. We're working with them right now to sign conduct for unplanned encounters at sea, so they won't take these actions against our Navy and other forces as well. But at least to have that open and frank dialogue for the very same reasons that are mentioned here. Our sense is that China does not want to be a global hegemon, but they clearly want to be recognized as the regional leader in this area. So I do a lot of work. I was in Hanoi, Da Nang, Manila just before the end of the year. 2 ASEAN countries that have been the most assertive in protecting their sovereign rights and their EEZ, where we see encroachment drilling off the coast of Vietnam, Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines, which is well within the EEZ of the Philippines. We're working with the Japanese Coast Guard that is doing capacity building to shore up, build up those navies, those Coast Guards, to assert their sovereign rights, and trying to get ASEAN to work collectively. As we have seen, China has worked bilaterally with the ASEAN members, and as their economies are very codependent, it's very easy for the ASEAN countries to be splintered off and to get everyone to, from a regional approach. But we find as Coast Guards become that soft diplomacy piece, and there may be an opportunity there to perhaps open a dialogue, because right now it has been opaque, and it's important that we have better transparency.
I remember in 2010 being in Beijing, early 2011, with Secretary Gates, your old boss, General Milley. And he said to us at that time he believed the intent of the Chinese were to push both the Navy, Coast Guard, all of American forces out to the second island chain, keep them out of their territory of the Pacific. Do we still think that's their intent? Do you agree with that?
I would just advocate, if you haven't read the book by Robert Herrick called Fire on the Water, which really delineates this whole access denial. And so if you look at it, if you want to study the United States, it's like going back to Mahan. And now, the China Coast Guard's building 10,000-ton cruisers. This looks like Teddy Roosevelt, big white ship, from that era as well. But study, our vulnerabilities. And so, for what it takes to put a carrier strike group together, you can build an anti-ship cruise missile for $2 million. And if you can launch a swarm of those, you might argue you have access denial. Build quiet subs and put those in the straits. And it doesn't even address mine warfare. So they're looking at, rather than go peer-to-peer, it's almost an asymmetrical approach to what the strengths of our military is. To build that up. But I thought Robert Herrick did a very good job articulating that in his book, Fire on the Water.
General Neller, I was just back from a week in South Korea last week, and it's pretty obvious that we've seen a big ramp up by the North Koreans in activity in just the past 6 months. Missile tests, one nuclear test, the possibility of another one ahead of their Workers' Party Congress, which meets for the first time in 36 years later on this week. Tell us a little bit about how we're thinking differently today, if at all, about the contingency of being once again in a conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, since I've been in service, Korea was always the big fight, or potentially the big fight, because of the politics involved and the aggressive nature of the North Koreans, regardless of who the leader was. And the current leader is taking that to the next level. So I think their provocations, which go back to the sinking of the South Korean ship and the things they've done with missile technology and missile shots, makes everybody a little bit nervous and makes the whole region unstable. So I think it's kind of a two-prong approach. The ability to communicate directly with them is probably beyond my understanding of the politics of this, but I think we are going to have to figure out how to communicate, ideally through probably the Chinese, and leverage the Chinese to do that. At the same time, I think we have to continue to reaffirm our treaty obligations that we have with the South Koreans, and the fact we've got forces there, and that we're part of an international alliance throughout the region. So As far as thinking it different, I think part of the discussion that we've had, or at least I've had in my own mind, is before it was annoying and it was kind of a difficult thing, but now the capabilities that they're looking at, we know they have nuclear weapons, but they haven't had the means to deliver them to the homeland. And if that's where they're going, then I think that changes kind of the calculus in this whole thing.
And now we believe that even if they can't deliver them here, they probably do have a short-range nuclear capability. And how does that change the calculus? The first time you could have a North Korean nuclear weapon that can reach American forces?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is be able to protect ourselves and protect our citizens and protect our allies.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a capability to do that. It's interesting with some countries is that when you do things in response to their actions, and they then accuse you of doing something to aggravate them, which causes them to do something. So you get into this tit for tat thing, and I think the real issue is how do you, okay, let's stop. We need to set back on this. I mean, the Chinese would say that they're doing what they're doing with the land reclamation because of our behavior in the South China Sea, and we're saying no, we're not doing it. We're doing it in response to yours. We're doing it in response to the things you're doing. So how the military is not, you know, we're part of the national elements of power. We're going to do what we have to do to support the policymakers. So that's a difficult, very difficult policy question on how do we get the reset on this. But at the same time, I think we have to make it very clear that one, we're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to defend the homeland, and we're going to defend our allies.
Very good. Let's turn the question a little bit to resources, something that all five of you have to think about regularly. So we're trying to do a very difficult balance here. You're going to have counterterrorism operations, whether it's ISIS or something like it, for as far as the eye can see, we suspect. And you're going to have all these other big challenges, and we haven't gotten to Russia yet as well. Same time, General Milley, you're probably going to be moving from a force that right now is about, what, 470,000 active.
Right.
You're going to go down to at least 450.
Mm-hmm.
You still have some sequester issues going on. And yet, you also have a discussion going on in the country about whether or not we even want to be engaged around the world as fully as we have been. We've heard in this campaign, we've heard more than a few candidates talk, the one in particular, about whether or not we even want to pull back from some forward deployment areas. So tell us a little bit about, as you look forward to the size of the force and where we deploy them in the next few years, what are you seeing?
Well, for the Army, David, you mentioned going down to 450. That's the active Army, the regular Army. We've got the total Army. So we're about 1 million strong in the United States Army. So it's not...
that includes the reserve and the guard.
The reserve, the guard, and the regular Army. And we're going to go to 980 by fiscal year 18. And for the regular Army, that takes us from 479 or 480 or so today down to about 450 or so by 18. So the question is, is that sufficient capacity and capability to do the various national strategies? We think it is. We think that's sufficient capabilities to execute the strategies as they exist today. I'll stay out of any election politics. I have no idea what strategies will be in the future. But we think that we can execute what's asked of us today. The real hard question is what happens if one of these other contingencies were to go off. Bob Neller's talking about Korea, and John Richardson's talking about China, and we haven't even talked about Russia yet, or some of these others. And you mentioned the challenges that the Secretary of Defense mentioned. So the real challenge will be for all of us if there's something beyond what is currently happening in the world. And then we'll get into some really hard choices.
China is a long-term challenge for the reasons we discussed. Is Russia a long-term challenge, General Ultra? As you think about it, you're seeing renewed air patrols out along in Europe. You're seeing renewed submarine patrols as well, Admiral Richardson. As you look at what the Russians are doing, is this a temporary show of force at a moment of economic decline, or do you think we have a permanent resumption of activities we thought had gone away with the Cold War?
To a lot of our Eastern European and Nordic partner air forces, if you talk to them, they'll tell you that Russia never went anywhere. We just quit paying attention. And so I think from our perspective, due diligence would require us to assume that Russia is an enduring concern. And I think whatever they're doing now, they are still a very capable military, and they clearly have shown an intent to be disruptive, at least in the region. And so it's something we have to be concerned about in the future.
Admiral Richardson, we ran a story last winter, my colleague Eric Schmidt and I, about Russian submarine patrols that appeared to be looking at, among other things, the undersea cables that still snake across the Atlantic and Pacific. Talk about the ultimate hack of the internet. And the concern is you cut right through the cables, you cut a lot of communications right away. What are you seeing in the Russian Navy and submarine force?
You know, I would just echo what Mark said, is that in many ways, particularly in the undersea forces, Russia never really took a break. They've been active in there. Now, with respect to their building program and a steady patrols, not visible, of course, because that's the whole nature of that business. But what we're seeing lately is a resurgence of activity there that really, you have to go back to the 1990s, you know, kind of Cold War levels of activity to see the same number of patrols that we're seeing. And so we're watching that very closely. It's a changing dynamic. Even if you ran the numbers, did the threat analysis 5 years ago or so, you know, we probably wouldn't have included Russia in that calculus. So that's why in the Navy we're running those numbers again. We've got a project going on this summer to do that. What is the appropriate force structure in the Navy when combined with the joint force that can take on the missions that we've been assigned, including Russia, including ISIS, some of those, you know, forces that weren't even on the table last time we did this.
Something you heard in the campaign a lot in the past few debates was that the American Navy is going down to sizes, numbers that we hadn't seen in nearly a century, and yet you pack more technology onto every square foot of your ships than we've ever seen before as well. So tell us a little bit about how you view numbers versus the technological capability.
Well, first, if I could just sort of dispel the fact that we're shrinking, we're actually growing, right? So we're at 272 right now. We're going to be at 308 by the end of 2020, 2021, and so we're actually, the Secretary's been very successful in putting together a shipbuilding program that has us on a growth in terms of those numbers, and as you said, some of the technology that's resident on those platforms is really exquisite. With respect to the trade-off between numbers versus capability, it's a false choice, I think, a little bit when you think about we need to provide maritime security and credible options to our decision makers, and so you've got to have sufficient capacity so that you've got options out there if something should happen. You can achieve your strategic aims on a continuing basis and on a contingency basis. And then they have to have the capability to be credible, right? They've got to be competitive in those environments, and that's becoming more challenging as technology is becoming more sophisticated around the world.
We're all facing a problem, David, with this quantity versus quality issue. Yeah. Because quantity does have a quality all its own in our business. Mm-hmm. And you can have the coolest ship on the planet, but it can only be in one place at a time. And it can't be in the Gulf and in the South China Sea. And so numbers matter in our business. And one of the things we're all facing is that the military services have all shrunk. The Air Force is 40% smaller than it was in 1991. And the appetite to use the military instrument of national power has not diminished at the same rate. And so we just don't have enough to do everything we're asked to do and everything we could potentially be asked to do. If the term simultaneity enters the discussion, we have a problem.
And even without simultaneity, you have the pivot. President Obama talked about a move basically to reduce our focus on the Middle East a bit. He did this 5 years ago, begin to shift more and more assets to the Pacific, have roughly more of a 60-40 kind of mix toward the end of this. How are we doing on making the pivot a reality at this point?
Well, let me jump on that one. For us, as Marines, we have been historically a Pacific force. And because of the fights in Iraq and Afghanistan, we took a lot of the force structure we had there that we would deploy from the States to Okinawa or Japan, and we sent it to the Middle East. We've reestablished that force presence there. So you've got the full complement of 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force that's there with air, ground, and logistics. So for us, it was back to the future. But as much as many of us would like to not be able to focus on the Middle East, the world gets a vote. And so we are where we are doing what we're doing. I'd just like to go back to what the CNO and Mark Welsh said about numbers and quantity. You know, one of the discussions is that being forward deployed, having forward presence, deters aggression and assures our allies and allows us to respond to crisis and to keep a crisis from growing into a conflict. I'm not going to speak for my fellows up here, but I think we generally agree with that. But there is some discussion that, no, we should not do that. But by doing that, that puts pressure on the force. That causes us to deploy. It improves our training and our readiness, but it's expensive because, you know, we put hours on planes and miles on vehicles and
By doing
days
forward
by
deployment.
being forward deployed. So we think that's the way to go. I think that's the way to go to keep the world a stable and safe place. Now, it doesn't appear to be a very stable and safe place because there are people doing nefarious things out there. But I would just suggest if we weren't there, what else would they be doing if we weren't out there to monitor their activities and kind of keep an eye on things? So we are the global power. We are. We've been that since World War II, and that's been part of what we've done in this country. Not for gain, but for economic advantage for everybody, for the opportunity for people to establish their own way of life. And so that's, you know, what America has meant. You know, when you travel around, you go to Iraq, and there's people that don't like us, but I mean, you've been around the world. When you meet people, does anybody say they want to move to North Korea or Iran or Russia? They want to come to the United States. So we must be doing something right.
Just one or two last things, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. Admiral Zukumf, we had a discussion the other day about global warming and what potential threats that poses to populations, possibility of new conflicts that come up as you have rising seas. You said you were the Coast Guard sponsoring what sounded to me like a pretty fascinating expedition this summer. So
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about it and where we sign up for it?
Yeah. Well, a couple. Well, first of all, you know, we pushed out an Arctic strategy, but we did so in concert with the White House. So the White House has a strategy for the Arctic region with a number of milestones built into it, and then we have the compendium for it. In fact, ours came out the day after. And there's a saying in New York, I mean, in Washington, D.C., you know, there's enough strategies where if you swing a dead cat, you can't help but hit a strategy. But make sure, you know, you hit a strategy that reaches to the top tiers of our government. So I'll go back to last summer, and I was in Barrow, Alaska, our northernmost outpost along the north slope of Alaska. And what's happened is the sea ice up there has receded to record levels. And while we're up there, what they call storms would be Category 1, Category 2 hurricanes here in the continental United States. And during the middle of this de facto hurricane, they're moving silt to create a berm so it wouldn't inundate their only source of fresh water. These are Inuit tribesmen who have lived up there for more than the last millennium, and they say the ocean around us has changed. I've been out to Marzero, to the Marshall Islands, and if you go out there during what they call king tides, they're nearly up to their ankles in water. And they're saying the sea level is rising. And then this summer, I will take members of the Arctic Caucus, members of Senate, climatologists, and we're going to go out to what's called the Jacobshaven Glacier. Jacobshaven with a J, by the way. It is a glacier on the ice fields of Greenland that is moving during the summer months at the rate of over 8 miles a year. That is Mach speed for a glacier. It's calving, it's melting. And there are climatologists today that say the fuse has already been lit. We cannot turn back ocean temperatures. I don't assign causality to ocean temperatures. I have to deal with the consequences. But even when you look at Hurricane Sandy, when you have storm inundations that we have never seen before in history, And if you look at some of the climate maps of what would Florida look 50 years from now, where we have military infrastructure, where we have airports, we have maritime infrastructure, so we need to think long term. And it's very easy to think in 2, 4, and 6-year terms in election cycles and say, well, it won't happen on my watch. So we're just trying to observe and not add causality to what is happening in the oceans around us, because let's face it, 2/3 of the world is water. But we are seeing a rise in sea level, and we need to come up with strategies to address this, because there's a military component as well. Majuro, 70,000 people. Our compact, going back to 1986, we are beholden to their liberties and freedoms, but if they no longer have a home, then we need to make a home for 70,000 now climate changed refugees, if you will. So that's another element that we're going to have to look at as well. Bangladesh, by the year 2050, it could affect 18 million people with rising sea levels. So if you look at the refugees coming across the Aegean Sea, so we need to anticipate the movement of people and where will they resettle as we look at rising sea levels. And we need to think long term about this.
Well, let's turn to our members here, and we also have a number of members who are tuning in right now over a webcast, and we'll be getting some questions in from them that I'll be mixing in with this. I want to remind everybody that the meeting is on the record, so that means that not only are the answers on the record, the questions are on the record. So you might want to think about that for a moment. And if you'll wait for a microphone and give us your name and affiliation, and please limit yourself to one question, and please actually make it a question. So let's see, who will be first? Gentleman right back here.
Father Andrew from St. Paul's Foundation on Mount Athos. I wanted to ask about the role of chaplains in forward areas. If each of you could speak a little bit about that. I mean, I've been to Aleppo 25 times in the last 4 years, but I've met many special forces from the United States. I haven't seen one chaplain. But our men are dying. They deserve the sacraments. Why not?
Well, the Army's been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've suffered a lot of casualties. About 70% of the casualties have been Army. And I can tell you from being a commander at various levels in that combat, the chaplains play a critical role. And they are out there. You may not have seen them, but they're there. And as the saying goes, there's no atheist in a foxhole sort of thing. I can assure you from personal witness that chaplains are out there. They're doing incredible work day in and day out, counseling soldiers in the midst of a fight, but also after the fight when the trauma is sometimes very, very serious. So the Army chaplains are out there, and I can assure you that each of the services chaplains are very, very active.
There's no Marine Corps unit, just like an Army unit or a Navy ship that sails, or an Air Force squadron or a Coast Guard ship, that doesn't go where they go forward, or even in garrison without a chaplain. They're not, whatever faith they are, they're there. And they're huge combat multipliers, because as General Milley says, even though if you went whenever chapel would go based on your prospective faith, there may not be a lot of people at church, but when people start shooting at you, everybody gets religion.
Every battalion has a chaplain.
And so what I would suggest to you, Father, is what we need more chaplains. So maybe, God bless you for going to Aleppo, but why don't you come to Fort Bragg or Camp Lejeune and we'll sign you up.
I was going to ask all of you about recruiting. I didn't realize you were going to do it while you were here.
He looks perfect.
Thank you. This would be directed to General Milley. My name is Roland Paul. I'm a lawyer. A long time ago, I was an OSD. You responded to David's question about saying against ISIS that you were going to have an indigenous force. It kind of seemed to me sliding over the part about the split between the Sunnis and the Shia that were going to be in this force, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little more without going into battle plans. What are you going to have enough Sunnis to carry the day, or what will happen if they're all Shiites and they come into Sunni territory? Could you say us a little more on that, please?
Well, the self-proclaimed caliphate, that is the geography of ISIS that they currently control, is fundamentally Sunni territory. but the Iraqi security forces are a mix of both Sunni and Shia. But there's indigenous forces that are a mix of both. It is obvious from my time over there that Shias have a difficult time operating in Sunni territory, and Sunnis have a difficult time operating in Shia territory. But I think the military capabilities of the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish security forces that are operating in those areas and the various indigenous forces that we're working with, I do think that given sufficient time, and as long as we stay on track and we keep executing what we're doing, and I think we will be successful. I think there is sufficient forces. The bigger question is, once ISIS is destroyed, then what? Right. What force is going to go in there to stabilize, to administer, to govern, and that could be a challenge, especially on the Syrian side of the border. On the Iraqi side, it'll be the Iraqi government's security.
Follow that for a sec, and tell us a little bit about what kind of Iranian presence you see, whether it's changed much since the Iranian nuclear accord, whether you're seeing as much activity as you did before then.
Well, I don't think it's a state secret that the Iranians are in Iraq with a variety of capabilities that they have, and they work closely with a variety of the Shia groups, and they have a fair amount of influence. There's no doubt about it. But it's also, I think it would be a mistake to characterize the Iraqi government or the Iraqi security forces as a surrogate of Iran. I don't. My personal observation is I don't see that. Elements within it, sure, Shia militias, the Sadrists, those kind of organizations. But the Iraqi security forces themselves, I think, are largely loyal to their government, and they want to defeat ISIS as well. The issue with the Iraqi security forces is not so much one of loyalty and religious confession sort of thing. It is one of capability. It's leadership, training, equipment, and for about 2 or 3 years there, they had a big gap, and they became essentially very poorly trained, poorly led after we left from 11 to 14. And then when ISIL or ISIS attacked in the spring of 14, they were pushing essentially against an open door, and the Iraqi security forces collapsed coming down the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys. So that force is now being rebuilt. They've taken Ramadi, they've taken Heat, they're in Anbar, they're repositioning some capabilities up towards Mosul. So they are performing, they're actioning targets, they're out there attacking ISIS in a variety of places. So there is the Sunni Shia piece, that's for sure. That's still there. That'll always be there. But I think there's more to it than just that.
Could I just, on this question, I agree with Mark about the Iraqi security forces. They're going to do fine. They're going to be successful. They're being hugely successful in Anbar right now. But we've been to this movie before. The real end of the movie has to be when an Iraqi government can present itself and govern all people in Iraq.
Right.
If that doesn't happen, like it didn't happen after 2011, we're going to see this movie again. Mm-hmm. And that's why we can't fix this. I mean, we could fix it short term, in my opinion. But it's got to be. There's never been a successful counterinsurgency or a counterfight against an adversary when there wasn't a government that was legitimate, stood up, and took care of all the people within the boundaries of that state. And if that happens, then there's a chance, which is why you see, I believe, our government supporting Prime Minister Abadi and trying to bolster him because he appears at the present time to have the best potential to create a state that supports all Iraqi people.
That's right. The issues are less military than political.
Economic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
K.T. McFarland from Fox News. General Neller, you talked about North Korea having nuclear weapons and just really it's a matter of time before they get delivery vehicles to deliver them to nearby and potentially even to the United States. What are we doing about missile defense? And not just to you, but any of you. What are we doing about missile defense? And particularly looking forward to a world where there will be several nuclear weapons capable states, bad guy states.
Well, it's very dangerous to have a Marine infantry officer talk to you about ballistic missile defense. But in a previous job, I actually had to kind of break open the books and learn about this. So I would say, without getting into details, that we have a very capable ballistic missile defense. We have the ability to track and find and see, and given certain, it's not perfect, but it's better than what anybody else has got. So we have sea-based interceptors, we've got other interceptors, we've got radars, we've got abilities. The question is, you know, we've only got so many bullets. So our adversaries, not necessarily North Korea, but other countries like Iran, have developed a very large inventory of short, medium range missiles that are just conventional weaponry. But they could very easily overwhelm, you know, a certain number of Patriot batteries or other capabilities that have a capability to shoot them down. So we watch this all the time, and coming to the point where we're counting the number of missiles that are there, and we're trying to come up with the force ratios. Admiral Gortney, soon to be replaced by General Laurie Robinson at Northcom. That's their job. That's what they do. And so, you know, I'm confident that if 1 or 2 missiles were fired by an adversary, that we have the capability to defeat that missile. It depends, though, if you get into a large exchange, God forbid. So I'll stop there and let somebody like Mark Welsh or CNO or General Milley, who actually owns most of the shooters and the Patriot batteries and stuff, let them talk.
There's a very robust, very sophisticated integrated air, naval, and ground integrated air missile defense system scattered all around the country and overseas. And it's been tested, and I'm very confident that it depends on volume, but I'm very confident it'll be successful.
When I was in South Korea, there was, of course, a lot of debate about getting the South Koreans to adopt very quickly a THAAD system that would help against the threat that KT was describing, which was a North Korea that could actually put a nuclear weapon on a short-range missile. Would that do the trick if the South Koreans agreed to take it?
Do the trick.
Meaning,
depends.
if you had an attack of just 1 or 2 or a handful of short range.
You know, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, independent of each other, don't win wars. All of us together, and it's a whole of government. It's a joint force, whole of government with allies. It's an integrated system. So there's naval ships out there, there's radars, there's air capabilities, and then there's the ground capabilities. So the THAAD, in and of itself, the THAAD do the trick? No, the integrated system would do the trick, of which the THAAD is a subcomponent.
Yeah, I'd like to comment just a little bit. First, I'd like to just endorse everything that's been said, particularly, you must have read those books a couple times.
Well done.
So that was nice to lead us out there. And then...
I read the MIT program.
Yes. You can get them online now. You just watch the movie. But I'll tell you, you know, we are, I would have to say, there's an issue of magazine depth there in terms of interceptors, and there's, you know, we're on the wrong side of the cost curve as well.
Exactly.
And so I think that, you know, you talked about future technologies, future of the force. You know, I believe we are on the cusp of some technologies that'll turn that cost curve around with sort of directed energy and those types of technologies that'll allow us to be much more effective and sustain this fight a lot longer, really bring the cost per round down and increase our magazine depth.
Directed energy, anti-missile, sort of what was imagined back in the Reagan era, but is now actually, you think, getting closer to a reality?
I think we're getting closer to those types of solutions, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, we started with a very complex approach to this, and the fundamental reality on the economic side is it's got to be cheaper to shoot it down than it is to fire it. And we're not anywhere near that yet. That's where we have to go in the technology that John's talking to.
Very good. Let's see, right back here. Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen. That's all right. I'm Andres Tanakis from a consulting firm here in town, and also Lieutenant X from the USA. I have a question about what has been called hybrid warfare or gray conflict. How does the U.S., how does DOD, and how does the wider government plan for opponents that may seek strategies that stay under a threshold of a military response, that try to use less than fully attributable means to prevent DOD from responding to them? What can DOD do, and what can the whole of government do to deal with those kinds of problems?
We're discussing a Ukraine-like situation, but not limited to Ukraine, of course. Who wants to take that?
I don't want to take, because I gave a speech up at Norwich a week ago, and I used the word hybrid and little green men, and everybody's saying I'm talking about aliens coming into America, so I'm staying away from it this time.
Yeah. He's an internet sensation now.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll
So
take.
who wants to be the next internet
I'll
sensation?
go on then, Paul.
Let the Marines can deal with it.
He read the book and he saw the movie.
Yeah.
You look like an alien.
He's a little green man.
I think he looks like an alien, don't you?
You should all be so lucky. I think what we've seen the Russians do, where we kind of got this hybrid war thing in Ukraine, is where they took advantage of the political situation and the ethnic laydown of people that live there. And there was already political unrest. So what are we doing about that? What I think we've done, and we continue to do, is we work with nations who have come to ask us to help them train their force to be able to counteract this. And we talked earlier about the internet and cyber warfare. You know, I would say, David, one of the things that the reason that we are more involved in cyber is the adversary has gone to this domain, and we are not going to cede that to them. We are not going to cede that domain, whether it's they're recruiting on it or whether they're messaging on it, whether they're providing disinformation or propaganda or however you want to couch it. You know, we cannot just sit there. This is different than, you know, attacking networks and water systems and all that. This is just contesting messaging and words and ideas and thoughts on what we would call social media. So what we've done, and this is more of a special operations thing, and if General Thomas or General Votel were here, they could wax much more eloquently about it, but I think what we've done is, first of all, identified the problem, seen that it has certain traits or characteristics that are identifiable, and then helped our partner nations develop counter capabilities to include intelligence and messaging and information so that when they see something like this, they can confront it and call it out. And they don't sit there and wait and somebody's like, hey, who are these guys walking around dressed like this? And what did they say and how did this story get planted? And then there's a political aspect to it. So it's very clever, very insidious. And it's, you know, as you said, it's war without war. I mean, that's the, you know, Sun Tzu, the ability to defeat your enemy without having to fight them.
Is cyber the little green men of the future in that the attribution issue is still so difficult for the U.S. government that frequently you don't know whether the adversary at the other end is a state, a non-state actor, a bunch of teenagers sitting in a basement?
I mean, cyber causes us problems because we're a nation of laws, and we respect the rights of every citizen in this room. And so we are reluctant to pass through your web page or your website to get at somebody who's on the other side of that firewall who's lying and violating the law. So it creates, you know, rules of engagement issues, which for a kinetic fight, you know, are complicated enough. And so our adversaries are very clever. They know what our strengths and our weaknesses are, and they use those against us. So we're going to have to be, we've thought about this a lot, but it all involves permissions and authorities. As Admiral Richardson said, you know, every day our networks are under attack. And our ability to identify those people that are attacking us, I mean, yeah, we can pour boiling oil over the wall and scrape them off the wall of the castle. But if I can see them over there in the woods forming up to make their attack, do I have the authority to?
And right now you do not, except
it depends on the context and the legalities if we are in a designated area of hostilities or we're not. So it's under certain contexts, yes, we do have those authorities, and at least for Title 10. And I'm not going to speak to those authorities that are available to the President of the United States and the national leadership under other authorities that they use to protect the nation.
If I could go back, you know, I think that to just kind of get back to this gray warfare or whatever it is, and the cyber piece, and you know, we should be very clear that you know, there's no more capable nation or actor in the world than the United States in terms of cyber warfare. So, you know, it's important to understand that you know, up front. But you know, it is the nature, I guess I'm a classicist in that the nature of war really hasn't changed. And we are going to, it is a contest between thinking adversaries, and they are going to study our vulnerabilities, and they're going to target those vulnerabilities to achieve their aims, right? I mean, that's just sort of at the macro scale. Your father went up, his job off of Okinawa was the fighter director, who was the person who vectored fighters in to go against the kamikaze threat, which was the only thing in World War II that Admiral Nimitz said he did not anticipate by virtue of his participation in the war games in Newport, right, that resulted in War Plan Orange. We're going to be surprised. We've got to build in an inherent agility and adaptability, and so we're seeing that we're confronted with a new form of competition here. We're realizing that we may have been a little bit too dogmatic in terms of phases of warfare and such, and our competitors are targeting that vulnerability, and we'll respond.
David, one last comment on that, just real quickly. From a grand strategy perspective, what this question and what John just said highlights the fact that whether it's Chinese expansionism or Russian buffering or cyber or it's hybrid warfare, it all creates uncertainty. And from a grand strategy perspective, instead of worrying about what China might be, Russia might be, where cyber might go, it's helpful if the United States of America decides clearly what we are going to be 50 years from now. Other decisions will fall from that because the nation that puts certainty into uncertain situations has an advantage.
I think, David, that's a really key point. It goes back to how big the forces are. It goes back to the capabilities, et cetera. The very first thing that has to get answered is what's the role of the United States in the world? How do we define ourselves? And I think that question has to be asked and answered before we get into details about tactics and operations and all that kind of stuff.
Well, we're in the midst of a campaign that may actually be addressing that some in the next few months. Right here.
I'm Padma Desai, economics professor at Columbia University. Some of the provocative activities of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Russian fighter plane zooms into Lithuanian territory. A Russian submarine floats in and out of Swedish waters in the Baltic Sea. Can we handle these activities beyond cyber monitoring militarily? Is it possible? Do our smaller NATO partners, Albania, Bulgaria, even Poland, which border Russian border, do they feel safe enough with proper equipment, soldiering, and whatever is necessary so that Vladimir Putin doesn't mount an attack on little Albania?
Who wants to handle that?
I'll start. No, they don't feel safe. They're concerned. I think clearly if you go to the Baltic states and talk to them, they're concerned. I think the issue is if Russia decided to cross another border, could you stop them? The answer to that's probably no. Could you move them back across the border? That would be a major undertaking. And so that's really the question. Will we honor our alliance to NATO or not? And there's partners all over the world watching this.
And is the redeployment of some NATO forces that are circulating through this area sufficient to create a deterrent for that?
We certainly hope so.
That's what we're
none
trying to
of us
achieve,
know that answer, David. Yeah, we just don't know.
We're trying to assure the allies and deter any further aggressive behavior. The strategic situation with Russia is fundamentally different than it was prior to, say, 2005, 2004. Russian behavior changed. Russia has aggressively crossed sovereign international boundaries that have been sovereign countries since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89-90. That is a strategic condition that has not existed in Europe for 7 decades. The 56 Hungarian invasion they weren't a sovereign country at the time. They were part of the Warsaw Pact. Soviet forces were already there. 68 in Czechoslovakia, Soviet forces were already there. This is a fundamentally different situation. And it's happened in Crimea, it's happened in Georgia, it's happened in eastern Ukraine, and then add on to it all these aggressive incident type behaviors and battle rolls over aircraft and challenging ships and submarine activity and cyber activity. You add it all together and connect those dots. That's a fundamentally different external behavior of a nation state. And that is something that needs to be closely monitored, confronted, and I think each of our services, our national leadership has asked us to do certain things with capabilities, and we're doing that. You're seeing some of that play out, and with a bit of luck, it'll assure our allies and deter any further aggressive actions by Russia.
So we have just a few minutes left, so we're going to do a little lightning round and collect up just 2 or 3 questions and ask them to answer the ones they want to answer and avoid the rest. Right, so we'll start with you, sir.
Thank you. John Elliott, Princeton University. Is NATO obsolete? Do we still need NATO or not?
Okay, do we still need NATO? A question I think I've heard in the campaign here or there. Right behind you, if you take that one.
Hi, I'm just curious, what's on your wish list? If you could set aside sequestration for a moment, what is, the top thing you want? Is it more F-35s? Is it another carrier strike group? Is it more Marines? Thank you.
And we'll take one more out here. There was a hand right over here.
Herbert Levin, council member for Admiral Zukumf. Don't you think that the Coast Guard shortfall in ships, etc., is much more compelling than the Navy's need for more carriers? Would you object strenuously if the decision was made to shift part of the Navy budget to the Coast Guard?
This guy's going to have to take this outside. Yeah. Okay.
Classic ploy, drive the wedge, We're just not going to fall for that. Right?
Well, we'll see. Okay. So, let's start with the NATO question, which was, do we still need it? And let's make it a little more complicated by asking the question, do we still need it if the NATO members other than the United States don't pay a larger and larger share?
Largest period of sustained lack of conflict in Western Europe in history, I think. Yes, we still need NATO. The good overrides the bad. It always has, always will. NATO was an alliance of necessity when it began. It became an alliance of choice. As nations saw the benefits of being a member, it's now an alliance of necessity again. We just have to understand that the texture has changed. But I believe we need NATO.
It's been very effective. Very effective, as pointed out, for 7 decades, and I commanded NATO ground forces in Afghanistan. It's still an effective alliance, and I absolutely think it's needed.
Concur, and they are responding. NATO is responding to this changing dynamic in Europe, and so they have been effective, and they'll, I think, remain effective as they respond.
Oh, sorry.
As a former NATO staff officer at SHAPE, it's a political alliance. It's kept the peace in Europe since the end of World War II. And when you look at the overall amount of money it's really nothing. So if not NATO, then what? I mean, I think the only people that are questioning NATO are Americans. And I think we'd be much better off if we were a little more supportive, and those countries have capability. We need to be less dismissive of them and figure out how to use them in a more effective, better way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. To the question of wish list.
You go if you want.
Red Sox to win the series.
This will be a.
I'm with you on that.
I'll make this a twofer, actually. And so we talked a lot about the Mideast, talked a lot about ISIL, South China Sea. An area we didn't talk about is Central and South America, our hemisphere. Can anyone here name 8 out of the 10 most violent countries in the world? The top 2 are
Honduras
in
and El
Central
Salvador.
America. Mm-hmm. So how did they get that way? Why did we have over 60,000 unaccompanied minors show up via human traffickers at our southwest border? Because some of the most violent crime, believe it or not, is in our backyard. So in my role, meeting with all of the presidents of Central America, the problem they're dealing with is that bulk shipments of cocaine land in those countries, are broken down to retail for consumption into the United States. President Cerrone in El Salvador, President Varela in Panama, President Hernandez in Honduras, is looking to the United States and saying, we can't fight this alone. In fact, we don't even have a Coast Guard, let alone a Navy. They give us very broad authority. So we have 42 counter-drug agreements that allow us to use deadly force right up to the shoreline of another country. Today, I've got probably in the neighborhood of 15 tons of pure uncut cocaine on ships deploying in these areas today. Whole of government, intel driving operations. But 2 years ago, we had 4 ships down there. So we doubled the numbers. We're not doing as much stuff elsewhere. At the same time, the CNO had to decommission the Perry-class frigates, which are doing the lion's share of duty. We changed the narrative of why we need to recapitalize the Coast Guard, but people listen. You have to demonstrate outcomes and the impact on regional stability where the United States has an inherent responsibility. So our acquisition budget, it doubled this last year in 2016. So we are no longer a do more with less Coast Guard. Will we ever have everything we need in our kit? Absolutely not. The other key piece in this, if you're going to build public trust to invest in a service, we doubled down on our financial auditing process. So 3 years in a row, we have a clean financial audit opinion. Our acquisition portfolio has grown less than 2% over the last 2 years. So you want to make, you want to build public trust. One, that you'll produce outcomes, but 2, you'll be a good steward of the resources you invest in. And when you buy a new ship in the Coast Guard, well, 50 years later, we're still operating these darn things. I did a change of command on a ship not that long ago where the ensign, whose father was on that ship, whose grandfather was a captain of that ship. So I think the only thing like it is Her Majesty's ship Victory that Lord Nelson served on. So yeah, we do need to modernize, but the good news is when you say, what do you need? You need to be able to modernize, but you need to maintain your force structure at the same time. We've had pretty good success at that here of late without going after my dear friend John Richardson's Navy budget.
General Welsh said that he's got something on the wish list, so maybe he'll talk to us about the F-35.
Probably not. Although you'd all look really good sitting in it, just like we do. The only thing on our wish list, really, and I think I would speak for everybody up here, is that the incredible men and women who continue to wear these uniforms and sit in this front couple of rows and stand in the back continue to want to serve this country, and that their families want to stay and support them. As long as that happens, we're fine.
Amen.
Well, I want to thank all 5 of you. I want to thank the audience for coming here and for such terrific questions. I hope we keep this tradition going for many years more. It's always one of the most interesting and invigorating evenings at the Council. And it reminds you that you really have multiple jobs here. You've got jobs thinking about the current threats. You've got the jobs thinking about the future of the force. And you all have a third job as diplomats in many ways. It's come through in all of this discussion about how you're trying to put together coalitions, how it is that you're attempting to build force multipliers, and it's a very different job than your predecessors had. I think that came through in the discussion tonight, so thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Chief?